Okay, so I'm Kate Kelly. I'm the chair of the Hinesburg Conservation Commission and also work for the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, which is really my training as a herpetologist, a biologist who studies reptiles and amphibians. And the Conservation Commission currently is busy doing natural resources inventory of the town, which is originally just sort of a map-based viewer that you can go onto online, and you can turn on and off layers and see forest blocks and wildlife areas, and use it for water resources and look at review of developments and that type of thing. So we completed the first phase of that with the help of a consultant, and we're now entering the second phase, which is more of like a boots on the ground, visiting properties, looking at actual where wildlife are actually crossing roads, those types of things. So that's the reason that I'm here tonight, is to talk to you about how you guys can help out with the amphibian portion of our wildlife crossing data that we're going to be collecting this year. So I will go ahead and share a presentation. I'm going to go through our sort of basics of amphibians and amphibians here in Hinesburg. And then we'll get into the details of this actual project and, what you can do to help, and like sort of the details of the protocol and all that jazz. So if you're here for just sort of want to learn about amphibians, great. You can tune in for the first part and then feel free to sign out after that. If you want to learn more about the actual volunteering aspect of it, just sit tight and we'll get to that sort of more towards the end of the presentation. Okie dokie. Okay, so hopefully everyone is seeing my screen now. Okay, so a little bit of background. Vermont has 21 species of amphibians. There are 19 species of reptiles as well. Of our amphibians and reptiles, they're approximately evenly split with about 10 species of each for salamanders, frogs, snakes, and turtles. We have a few fewer turtles than the rest, and one lizard. You guys have probably all learned this at one point in your lives, but just a little refresher. Typical frog life cycle. So you've got an adult frog up at the top of your screen here that goes usually to water to breed. So it mates with a male and a female come together. Female lays eggs and the male fertilizes those eggs in the water and lays usually attached to vegetation in the water. Those eggs hatch out to become tadpoles. The tadpoles then sprout some back legs and eventually some front legs and come out on land, usually looking like little miniature versions of their adult selves. Salamanders are pretty similar in that the adults go to water. Usually, I say usually go to water because you'll learn about a little bit of a variation on that life cycle in a second. Go to water, and in this case, they actually have what's called internal fertilization. So the male lays down a packet of sperm called a spermatophore, usually on the bottom of the pond, and the female then picks up that spermatophore in her vent or her cloaca, and it fertilizes the egg internally, and then she lays the eggs up to a couple days later. So these are the eggs you see, and those eggs then hatch out to become small larval salamanders. They have all 4 of their legs for most of their larval phase, and they usually have these external gills that you see here. That's how they get oxygen out of the water. We do have a variation on that here in Vermont. We do have some salamanders that are entirely terrestrial. So they actually go through that phase of like the larval with the gilled young salamanders right inside the egg. So these guys lay their eggs on land, usually in a wet spot because they do need to remain moist, just like all our amphibians do. And when these young hatch out of the eggs, they look just like little miniature adults. They don't have the gills. They don't go through an aquatic phase. So we do have one species that's fully terrestrial here in Vermont. All right, so why do we care about amphibians? Well, oftentimes they're considered indicators of habitat health. They're pretty sensitive to pollutants and changes in the habitat whether that's, forest cover or, use of these two different types of resources. They often require both the water and the connected overwintering areas or forest habitat. And so if we end up messing up either the water or the forest or somewhere in between, they can really indicate what's going on with our habitats. They do play a really important role in our ecosystems, both as prey and as predators. They affect the little detritivores that are down in the soil by eating them. And then a lot of things eat our salamanders and our frogs. About a third of our amphibian species worldwide are critically endangered, or vulnerable. And herps, reptiles and amphibians, are the vertebrate group that is most vulnerable to road mortality. They take a long time to get across roads. They're very small, so people don't see them. And they have to cross roads oftentimes to get to their breeding grounds or back to their overwintering areas. So as I just hinted at, amphibians migrate twice a year. They have to go between their uphill or forested habitat. Usually that's like a deciduous forest. That's where they overwinter, and they spend the winter usually underground if they can't freeze. Some of our species are freeze tolerant, so they can actually spend it like in the leaf litter right on the surface of the ground. So they spend the winter there, and then they have to go down to the wetlands where they breed. So those are vernal pools, swamps, ponds, lakes, you name it. Oftentimes those are fishless because the fish are predators on tadpoles and young larval salamanders. So they like to choose these areas that don't have fish in them and don't have other large predators like large invertebrates that can eat them. Sometimes we build roads in between those two places. And so it's easiest to see amphibian movement where those roads pass between the two habitats, because our amphibians have to move there to breed. And then again, back in the fall, the young have to move back uphill, and the adults, if they haven't moved back uphill yet, need to move back to their overwintering site. So I mentioned Google Earth here because it's a pretty handy tool that you can use on your own to investigate areas near you that might be amphibian movement areas. If you're not in Hinesburg and you're just interested, you can test this out on your own. I use Google Earth a lot and fly around to try to find these, potential areas for movement. So I'll give you just a brief overview of that on Google Earth. If you happen to want to test this out, you download Google Earth Pro, and you go in and you can download topo maps. Just Google Google Earth topo maps online. You get a layer and you can look at topo maps, and then you can also look at the aerial photos of the same area. And so this is a known crossing area in New Haven, actually. So the road in white down the center, you can see this nice forested habitat on the right side of the road, or east side of the road. And although you can't see it in this aerial map, go back one, in the topo, you can see that this is a large swamp on the west side of the road. So there are, I would say, thousands of amphibians that cross this section of road between the forested habitat and the swamp every spring, and again in the fall. So fun for exploration, but for you guys here in Hinesburg, we have done that work for you. So we have sort of some crossing areas picked out that we'll be able to assign to you so that you don't have to go through and do all that work. All right, so when do they migrate? Well, they migrate at night usually, and in the rain, because amphibians need to have moist skin. So they're not going to be out on a hot sunny day hopping across the road in general. But in rainy nights in early spring, and usually after dark, so like beginning about 30 minutes after dark or later. Usually the roads need to be wet, because that's, indication that the ground is wet, I guess, and that they're able to move easily across the road and stay moist. Temperatures need to be above freezing. You'll sometimes hear people say it has to be above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but it doesn't really. We've seen them migrating in snow and, with snow falling from the sky, and they're moving right along. They can go right up on top of the snow and still keep moving. It's pretty amazing. But at least some of that snow needs to have melted. So, they need to be able to get out from under from under their holes and get up on top of the snow surface. So we need to at least have some holes, you know, around the trees where they can move up and about. And then, as I mentioned, they do move more either after breeding, they go back uphill, or in the fall to get back to those overwintering sites. So it's not just like a one-time movement. You can see this happening over many nights. And of course, in the summer, there are also amphibians that are out and about, and they're just out and about eating. They're foraging for food. And so you'll see them, you know, hopping around the road, but it's not that they're like making a directional movement somewhere for winter or for breeding. They just happen to be out and about and looking for a snack. Okay, so now a little bit of Amphibian ID. I'm going to go through all the frogs first, and then we'll do salamanders. And I'm going to try to point out some of the characteristics that that are helpful when you're looking at these animals in the field and you want to figure out what the heck is this thing sitting on the road in front of me. So our first one, and probably one of our most common ones behind maybe the spring peeper, is the wood frog. A lot of people don't see these guys because they're, you know, pretty cryptic. They sit in the woods and they're brown and they blend in really well. You don't really stumble across them unless you just happen to be, you know, walking through the woods and go through an area where they are and see them hop or something like that. But they do cross the roads in great numbers in the spring. One of the great characteristics on these guys is this black mask that is sort of behind the eye. And they also have this bright white upper lip. So those are two things that are really helpful to use when you're looking at wood frogs. Generally, the back is brown, but it can be red. The females in the spring are often a bright, like sort of a rusty red color. But again, they all have the dark mask and this white upper lip that are really helpful. So they migrate pretty early. This is our earliest breeding species here in Vermont. So beginning potentially now, as early as about March 15th to June 1st is when we've seen them moving. And like I mentioned, they'll mate in the water. So this position is called amplexus, where the male here is on top of this reddish colored female in the water. And they lay a fairly large egg mass with pretty densely clumped eggs. Okay, so then the spring peeper. You guys have probably all heard these guys, pretty common in Vermont, very noisy, but not necessarily commonly seen. Little tiny critter, you know, only an inch and a quarter long, and they're young, which you're looking at in the bottom right here, are very, very tiny, like less than a centimeter. Those are centimeters, not inches. So this is just a little tiny baby. If you look at these guys, you'll notice that there is sort of a dark X-shaped pattern on the back, which is really our best field mark for the spring peeper, is to look for this X. And it's not always a perfect X. Sometimes it's kind of broken up. If you look closely at the toes, you'll see that there are these little round pads on the toes as well. We'll see that again when we get to the gray tree frog. They have even bigger toe pads, but that allows the peepers to climb a little bit. They have sort of these sticky toe pads, and they can climb up vegetation or even your, you know, window outside your house or something like that. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to two frogs that have a pretty obvious pattern on their back of spots. Okay, so we have the pickerel frog and the northern leopard frog. And I'll touch on the pickerel frog first. This one is probably more likely to be seen in Hinesburg, given our habitat and what we know is here. They have two rows of spots down the back, and similarly on the side, although this frog is maybe not the best example, usually two rows of spots down each side of the frog too. And those are fairly nicely arranged spots, like they're not just scattered. They're usually sort of rectangular shape. Again, variable, but sort of rectangular shape, if you can go with that. And they have this dark border around the spots. If you were to flip this frog over, which is in the bottom right of the screen here, you would see that they have bright yellow legs underneath. And that's a really important characteristic for us when we are looking at a frog that has spots. Okay, let's catch it. Let's look at it underneath and make sure that for a pickerel that it has those bright yellow legs. You'll notice that I put a little star here next to the word pickerel frog. As I go through, I'm going to star animals that we're asking that you take photos of if you're out there volunteering for us, just so that we can confirm your identification. Some of these are pretty easy to identify, and we pretty much trust you. If you think you saw a spring peeper, great, you saw a spring peeper. But sometimes pickerel frog and leopard frog are two that get a little bit confused. So if you see a spotted frog like this, just snap a photo of it. If you can, snap a photo of the underside of it so we can see those yellow legs. Because this is the similar frog. This is the northern leopard frog, which again has spots. These are sort of more randomly scattered spots, and they're usually more circular or oval shaped instead of those rectangular spots. They also have this really light halo around each of the spots. And of course, on the underside, no yellow, just white legs. This particular frog is a brilliant green color, but they're not all that color. Oftentimes they're tan or like a brown background color. So they can get a little more confusing with the pickerel frogs. And like I said, these aren't as common in Hinesburg. They have been seen here a few times, but much less likely than the pickerel. Okay, now one I think probably everyone is familiar with if you have spent much time outside, American toads, really common around human habitation too. They're pretty tolerant of, of humans, and they're likely to be found in your garden. They have these dark brown warts on their back, quote unquote warts. They won't actually give you warts, by the way, not a problem. They also have this large gland sort of behind, like on the back of the head, and that's on each side of the body. That's actually a poison gland. So if something eats a toad, like if your dog has ever eaten a toad or something like that, they'll froth at the mouth. It's a toxin and keeps a lot of predators away from eating them. Although some have learned to just not eat the heads, so they'll eat the bodies and leave the heads behind, which is pretty smart. And then the gray tree frog. If you're out early enough in spring, maybe you won't see this guy. They come out a little bit later in the year, but they have a brown, like sort of a gray brown skin with what we call a lichen pattern on it. If you can imagine lichen like sticking to a rock or a tree, sort of grayish, speckly pattern. And they always have this white spot right underneath the eye, which is a really helpful characteristic. So white spot under the eye on the gray tree frog. And again, just like the pickerel frog, they have this yellow on the inside of the legs. Sometimes not this brilliant. This one is really bright, but that's what they call a flash color. So it's sort of a warning to predators. They can kind of stand up if a predator's coming their way and show them that leg and be like, hey, stay away. I don't taste good. Okay, so now we'll do, these are three frogs that, again, are more of like a summer, I say like a summertime species, but we do sometimes see them moving across roads in the spring. These three all have green faces. So the front here of this upper lip is green on all three of these frogs, and they all spend time in permanent water. So lakes, ponds, large swamps, that type of thing. So first, the green frog. Again, one of our most common of these three frogs. Green face, so green upper lip. And what's really diagnostic on this guy is this ridge that goes down the back. This is called a dorsolateral ridge. So dorso meaning back and lateral meaning side. This is a ridge that goes between the back and the side. And that's really helpful for distinguishing between the green frog and the next frog I'm going to show you, which is the bullfrog. And the bullfrog, you can see, it doesn't have that fold of skin or that ridge right along the back. It's just sort of like a smooth back. Other than that, green frog and bullfrog look pretty similar. There's some slight differences in like the shape of the face and that kind of thing, but pretty similar. So look for that ridge on the back. And then this one I put in here because there is like the slimmest chance that it could be seen in Hinesburg, like really, really slim. You could probably ignore this section and be fine. This is called the mink frog. It's a northern frog, mostly found in the Northeast Kingdom, and reaches sort of the northern part of Vermont. But last year it was actually found in Moncton at Raven Ridge Natural Area. So like I said, like slim chance. It's really a cold water frog. It has more spotting on its back than the green frog does. So what you're looking here on the left side of the screen is a mink frog. On the right side of the screen in this photo, on the far right is a mink frog. And in the like left side of that photo is a green frog. So you can try to compare this green frog with one of the mink frogs on either side of it. So the mink frog has more spotting, and it also has some differences in this middle section of the leg. So if you look at just sort of this middle section of the green frog leg, you'll see that there's some barring that goes across the leg, like sort of across the axis of the leg. And if you look at either of these mink frogs in that same middle section, you'll see spots that run more longitudinal with the axis of the leg. So spotting here versus barring here. And again, like usually more spotting on the back of the frog, but not a big deal. If you see a weird looking frog out there and it looks sort of spotty, go ahead and take a picture of it and send it our way, and we can do the rest for you. Okay, so moving on now, salamanders. Take a sip of water here. All right, so this is sort of our biggest and maybe most well-known salamander, the spotted salamander. Black salamander, big yellow spots, like pretty unmistakable. When they're young, this is a baby that's just coming out of the swamp. You can see it has a little bit of yellow flecking on it, but a little bit harder to tell. But really for these big adults, even the young, 1-year-olds, they have nice distinct yellow spots for the most part. And just as a FYI, they lay these very compact egg masses with a lot of jelly on the outside of them. So if you ever see this big blob of hard egg mass, you could really like pick it up. It feels, it's about softball size, and it really holds together well in your hand. That's a spotted salamander egg mass. And just side note, this has nothing to do with ID of salamanders on the road. But if you're ever interested in learning the difference between a salamander and a frog egg mass, on the left side of the screen, this is a wood frog egg mass. And you can see how the outside of the eggs are bumpy. Like you can see the individual sort of contours of each egg. On the right side is a spotted salamander egg mass. You can't see those contours because there's an extra coating of jelly around the egg mass. And this one, it holds together really well in your hands. This one kind of falls apart a little bit more. So wood frogs on the left, spotted salamanders on the right. Next time you're out checking out your local vernal pool or whatever, you can impress your friends. Now we get into a little bit of confusion here. We have these salamanders that we have a Jefferson salamander and we have a blue spotted salamander. And the confusing part is that they, in the past, like thousands of years ago, hybridized. So they bred together. And so now we have these animals that look sort of like one and sort of like the other. And it's not really clear exactly what you're looking at. So we ask that you take photos of any of these that you find. If you see a big, large, this is like a 6 to 8 inch long salamander with no yellow spots. It's kind of a brown gray, background. It has a little bit of a different shaped tail. It's more of like a knife edge on the tail, so it's vertically compressed. But no other real distinguishing characteristics. It could be this sort of like a pure Jefferson salamander, but it could also be one that's sort of interbred with some of the other with blue spotted salamander genes, and you might see some that look a little bit in between. So again, we ask that you take pictures, and I'll sort of get to that in a minute. So here's that blue spotted salamander I was talking to you about. This is a fairly like medium-sized blue spotted. They get up to maybe 4.5 inches long, so not quite as big as the Jefferson does. but black with these blue flecks all over the body. And so you might, again, you might see animals that look a little bit in between. You might see Jeffs that have blue flecks, and you might see blue spotteds that are a little bit bigger and maybe have some of the Jefferson characteristics. So if you guys remember back when I was telling you about terrestrial salamanders and how they lay eggs on land and they don't need to go to water, this is our salamander that does that. This is the eastern redback salamander. It's also one of our most common species here in Vermont. In our forests, it lives, you know, if you have a wood pile, if you've been out in the woods and you're, I don't know, moving some rocks or logs, you've probably seen this guy. He's hanging out under those moist areas. Red stripe down the back. And if you flip it over, it's just got sort of a plain speckly belly. And again, this is on the bottom right is a young salamander that's probably just recently hatched out of the egg. So you might ask, well, why are these guys out on the road if they just live on the land, right? Like they're not going to water to breed. In some places, the place where they overwinter is no good for them during the summer, like it's too dry or maybe there's not enough food there. So they actually migrate a little bit, but not to breed, just to go find a better spot to spend the summer where they can survive, where it's maybe moister or they have more food. So you will see those guys on the roads. Now we're getting into some that are a little more rare. So this is the four-toed salamander. As far as I know, we do not have any documented records of this in Hinesburg, but you can see it looks really similar to that redback salamander. So it's got sort of a darkish red back. What we use to identify this, really the best field mark, is if you flip it over. You see the belly on this guy? It is really, really distinct. It's bright white with black spots. So if you happen to see a salamander that, you know, looks a little bit different than a redbacked, flip it over and look for this belly, or just put it in like if you have it in a container, like a clear plastic container, hold it up and look, you know, look at the underside and see what it looks like. This guy has a couple other characteristics that are helpful too. You can see, maybe you can see anyways, these markings on the back. They look like little chevrons coming down the back. Almost looks like it's got like a carved on the back. And although not the greatest picture, right here at the base of the tail, there's a little constriction. If it's a big fat adult, they store their fat in their tails, so they have like a big chunky tail, and you'll really see this constriction at the base of the tail. And essentially the reason for that is that if a predator comes and grabs its tail, it'll break that off. And so the salamander can get away. It'll leave its tail behind, and the predator gets distracted. The tail actually continues to move. It like flops around, and so the bird or whatever it is tries to eat that and probably gets a fairly good meal out of it, since that's where all the fat is stored. But salamander goes away to live another day and regrow its tail, which is pretty cool. All right, another one that you guys I'm sure have all seen, eastern newts walking around on land. This is the juvenile phase of the eastern newt called the red-effed. And they are bright orange, red spots, dark line through the eye. Pretty unmistakable, really, especially if you look for these red spots with little black borders on them. Sometimes they, a little pale, maybe it's a yellow color instead of a bright orange, but pretty much unmistakable as far as salamanders go. Okay, we're almost at the end of the ID part. We got 2 more salamanders to go. Hopefully I'm not throwing too much information at you guys here. So we have 2 more. These are, again, unlikely to be seen on roads because they are our stream salamanders. They live in our streams full-time, year-round. They breed in the rocks under the streams, lay their eggs there. The young grow up in the streams, and then they, spend their lives there. They do sometimes wander away from streams though. So we do occasionally see them on the roads. Like these guys can go maybe 100 feet from the streams. So they might go up the banks and over the edge. So the northern two-lined salamander, 2 dark lines, 1 down each side of the back. And if you flip this guy over, bright yellow under the tail. Best characteristic for him. Throw him in your clear plastic container, Look at the bottom of the tail. Is it yellow? Okay, we got a two-lined. There's no other salamander in the state that has that yellow underneath the tail. And then our other stream salamander, the northern dusky salamander, usually a pretty dark looking salamander without a lot of field marks on it. It does, when at certain phases anyways, when it's younger, it has this nice white line here from the eye down to the angle of the jaw. As it gets older, it usually loses that line and it just turns like almost all black. So it's, it can be a little hard to see. If you look at the legs on these guys, this can be helpful. The back legs are really, really strong and, sturdy compared to these spindly little front legs. These guys are really good jumpers. So if you get one and, you're trying to hold it in your hand, it will just like leap out of your hands and go flying. And that is thanks to those really strong back legs, that northern dusky. And again, no yellow under the tail on this one, just a pretty plain belly. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through a little bit of why we care, and then we'll do details of the actual survey and like what does this look like. Okay, so some sort of scary, sad facts in Vermont. We consume land at the rate of 75 square miles per decade. We lose 1,500 acres of forest per year. That's mostly to suburban and rural residential sprawl, and 200 acres of small wetlands per year. You guys may recognize this spot up at Five Corners. Unless land consumption is addressed, we're going to continue to lose all these things that we value: wildlife habitat, our species, the ecosystem services they provide, like pollinators for all of our, all of our fruit trees and our things that we love out of our gardens, our forest land, our agricultural land, and our quality of life. And unfortunately, it looks like this cut off a little bit, but we talk about sustainability, and there are things that we talk about frequently, when we're talking about like how, what can we do to be sustainable, right? Like we can recycle, we can improve our efficiency, we can use less resources per capita. But one thing that doesn't get discussed a whole lot is our human population. And here in Vermont, as you can see, our population has increased every year, every decade, and it continues to do so. So unless we address that, we can only go so far in our efficiency and our resources per capita use. We're going to continue to have an environmental impact. And this is one of those environmental impacts. Sorry for the gore, but lots of dead amphibians on the road. And until you get out there and start walking the roads at night, you don't really see these. You just drive right over them. So now a moment of uplifting, hopefully uplifting things. Down in Moncton, there was an area where there's a large swamp and a big overwintering habitat uphill from there. And there were just, thousands of animals getting decimated on the Moncton Virgins Road. They were able to build 2 underpasses with walls to help direct the animals to go under the road here. And these are large, large box culverts essentially that, bobcat can pass through. Like they're big enough for mammals to get in and out of the swamp as well. They stuck cameras in the tunnels to try to see what was using them. And they set them on like a 1-minute time lapse. So this is 1 hour of time. And you'll start to see these, this is a frog sitting right here in the middle of your screen right now. You'll start to see the animals moving through the tunnel. This is in one night, 1 hour of time in April, I believe, when they were moving to the down to breed in the swamps. Whoops. And hopefully it's going to play for you. There it goes. So pretty cool to see those, thousands of animals moving through that tunnel and really using it to do what they need to do to get to breeding habitat and then back up again in the fall. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Hinesburg Conservation Commission is working on this natural resources inventory. Our initial map is now available online. You can go in there and click around. There are lots of little layers and things that you can turn on and off and look at forest blocks or look at wildlife habitat, look at trails, water, water resources. So kind of fun to play around with if you like that sort of thing. But why you're here is to help learn about, our wildlife crossings. So we have a consultant this year who's been doing some tracking on the roads and sort of like priority areas around Hinesburg. And what I told him was that I would be happy to organize amphibian surveys with the help of volunteers. So first of all, like, what does this look like? What do you need to get out there at night and really contribute data? I do recommend a reflective vest, especially if you have a busy road section. It can be a little hazardous. People don't really expect you to be out there walking down the middle of the road on a rainy night, or at least some light colored clothing. Bright flashlight headlamps usually are not strong enough. I mean, some people have these really powerful, massive headlamps, but see if you can get one of those, either like a big, 4D cell, serious light, or I have a link to like a $20 one on Amazon that's really quite bright and smaller size to fit better in your hand. I do recommend bringing a backup light and some extra batteries with you, because sometimes you get out there and you're like, oh, I can't see anything. I need a little better light. Your raincoat, sometimes it happens, it rains on you because you are out on rainy nights in the spring. Something to write on and with, and I'll send you guys some data sheets. We'll talk about that in a minute. Ideally a camera or your cell phone, and a partner, so you don't get, crushed out there by a car in the middle of the night and nobody knows. It's important. Okay, so here's our map of Hinesburg. Consultant helped pull this together for us. So we have identified in red some high priority areas that we want to survey this year. There's also some orange areas, which are sort of medium priority, and yellow areas, which are low priority. My plan right now, depending on how many volunteers we get, is to essentially assign folks a segment or two. On some of these, they're very short, so it could be, maybe you can cover 3 or 4 in a night. And some of them, like this one here, is very long. This will probably just be like one, one long segment for someone to cover in a night. And you would go out, I would try to send out some emails, warning you like, hey, looks like good weather coming up. I'm going to go out tomorrow night. You would go out and try to survey your segment or segments, probably ideally at least 3 times over the course of the spring. So it would be, beginning sometime soon when the snow goes away and we start to get some warm rain again, and potentially April timeframe. And it may be a few times in April, it may be like April and May, something like that. Depends a little bit on what our weather does here. And you would just walk your section one way. So you would just go from one side of it to the other. And if you decide to walk it back and also count amphibians on your way back, you would essentially do 2 data sheets. It would be like 2 different surveys. So I'm shamelessly borrowing the North Branch Nature Center's amphibian road crossing data entry form, because I thought it worked pretty well and I didn't have to recreate it myself. So I'll just walk you through this. This is the paper format that you can use. I do recommend writing stuff down in paper. It's just, although it's sort of a hassle, it's a little bit easier than doing it online, I think, and trying to do it in the dark at night in the rain and, doing data entry that way. And so then you would take this and you would come home, and I'll talk to you about how to enter your data then into a Google form. Okay, so just zooming in on the spreadsheet, you've got your site code, which I'll assign you as just a number, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many people are surveying with you, what the temperature is outside, ideally like off either your car or an actual thermometer, not off, your weather app, which is not always very accurate. Who you are, your lead surveyor, and your email, what date you're out there, what time you start, and what end time you have. And then you just have a couple of weather things to check, is the road wet or dry? And what's the rain doing? No rain, sprinkling, raining, heavy raining, downpour. And how many cars went past you? You can keep track of that. Like in some cases, it's pretty easy. You only had 2 cars. Other times you might want to assign your partner the job of counting the 40 cars that drive past you as you're trying to, avoid them and count the things that are crossing the road. And then every once in a while you run into other people out there. Seems odd, but yes, there are other people who survey for amphibians. So if you're at like a known crossing site, you might see people out there from like the North Branch Nature Center's amphibian road crossing. And then it's worth it just to mention that, so we know like, hey, someone else was there already moving amphibians off the road, and maybe these numbers are not super accurate. All right, so then for the animals, we've got those common names I just talked to you about, and we've got the number alive and the number dead. So as you're going through the site, you're counting, and if you want to, you can move the animals off the road. You don't have to, but it's kind of nice, especially those live ones, like, hey, let me help you across the road here. So whichever direction they're going, you can, scoop them up either in your hands, or I've seen people use like a shallow dish and like a spatula or something to help like scoop them on and carry them across the road in the direction they're going and set them off on the side of the road. It won't, like, none of these amphibians are going to hurt you or do anything to you, and you're not going to hurt them unless you have, if you have like bug spray or something on your hands, that would be a problem. But if your hands are just your hands, it's it's no problem to pick them up and move them across the road. So as I mentioned, you're just going to record the ones that you had, how many live, how many dead. If they have a little dot next to them, you're going to try to take a picture of those animals. And down at the bottom here, you've got a little additional space to write things in, whatever you need to note about your survey. And then we'll talk here in a minute about data entry. But let me touch on photos first. So amphibians can be hard to focus because they're usually like dark and you're out at night, and sometimes you have them in your hand, and so they get like overexposed because they're really dark and your hand's light. And so I always recommend putting them, on a dark background, whether that's the road or, leaves or something. If you're using a cell phone, just tap the animal on your screen so that it focuses on the animal itself. And the lighting can be a little funky too, because you've got your phone or whatever it is, and you've got a light, maybe you have a headlamp on, and then you get the weird shadow from the phone. So I always recommend just like having your partner like hold a light sort of off to the side, maybe it's on, shining on the animal's face. So you get some nice lighting from the side, and then you can take your photo without too much difficulty. As I mentioned, for some of those species, it's great to get those photos of the underside too, if it's possible. Sometimes hard to do. On the salamanders, if you have a clear plastic takeout container or something, you can, put the salamander in there and hold it up and take a photo from the underside. That works pretty well, instead of trying to like hold the salamander and flip it over and get a photo. And again, take a photo of any of those starred species, quote unquote starred species or dotted species on the list, but also any that you're unsure of. If you just don't know what it is, snap a photo. And, if it's even generally in focus, we're pretty good at identifying things, even from blurry photos. So just send them our way. Okay, and then, so I've set up a Google form for data entry. So what happens, I'll show it to you here in just a sec, but you'll just go through and answer all the questions, which are essentially what's on the data sheet. And it's just like a drop-down menu for your site, and you've got buttons to select for the weather and that type of thing. And then you just go through and, okay, how many spotted salamanders alive, how many dead, type those numbers in, hit submit, and off it goes. If you have photos, sort of the ideal situation is that you actually label the photo. So sort of put it on your computer, or maybe you have some other way to label it. and you would write in like what you think it is, your site number, your name and the date. So I can tie that to your, to your data sheet. The alternative, since that's sometimes a hassle to actually go in and label the photo, is to send me the photos from each site in an email, like just one site, all these photos, and then send that info in the body of the email. So like your site number, your name, your date, whatever, so I can tie those together. And you can just submit those photos to this hinesburgcc@gmail.com email address. Okay, so let's see. I'm pretty much going to rely on email communications. So if you send me your email address, if you're interested, some of you I've already corresponded with and I already have you on my list. But if you are interested, please send me your email and tell me you're interested. And if you have like an area or a site that you prefer, please tell me that. Like I only want to do the southeast corner of Hinesburg or Swamp Road, or whatever you want to tell me, or I'm willing to travel anywhere. Similarly, if you have any what would I call them, like constraints, like I can only spend an hour out each night, so I can only do like one site, or I can I'm willing to be out for a longer time, I'm happy to do a bunch of sites, or whatever you need to tell me, and I'll try to sort it out and assign people things that make them happy, and I'll be in communication with you to make sure that whatever I assign you works for you. And as I mentioned, I'll send out those emails when the weather looks good for surveying. And you can then, obviously there will be times when people can't do it, and that's fine. But hopefully you can get in about 3 surveys over the course of the spring. And then you would enter your data online, email me your photos, and that is that. So if you give me just a second, I will try to show you that Google form. It's pretty straightforward, but it doesn't hurt to show it anyways. So hang on just a second. I'll try to share that form if I can figure out how to get there. Okay, there we are, sharing. Okay, I'm gonna move that so I can see it. Okay, so when you go to the website, I'll send you all this information too, by the way. Like, don't feel like you have to write down websites and email addresses and all that stuff. So you'll go in, you'll enter your email, your name, your crossing ID. This is a drop down. So you just select your number here out of there are like 43 sites. It's pretty substantial. And in order to show you this, I just realized I'm gonna have to like give this I gotta fill in the blanks, because see, it tells you the stars mean you have to do it. So we're just gonna fill in some fake info here so I can show you the next pages of the form. You're gonna type in your survey date today. What is it, 2022? And we started at 1 a.m. and we finished. We're not really starting at 1 a.m. Don't worry. And it's gonna be 5 degrees. And how many cars passed? We got 2. Now you just have your options here. It was partly cloudy and it was raining and the roads were damp. Okay, now we go to next. So we got all of our basic info in. So now you're on to salamanders. For each species, you've got an alive field and a dead field. You don't have to enter zeros, so just skip them if you didn't see anything. But okay, I saw 2 alive spotted salamanders, and we're gonna scroll right down through here. Oh yeah, I saw a Jefferson too. Okay, now I gotta send my photos in for verification. All right, gotta remember to do that. Going all the way down. If you see something weird, you see that 2-line salamander crossing the road, you're gonna write that 2-lined in there, and you had 2 of those. Okay, next. Frogs, same thing. I'm gonna skip through the frogs. You got all sorts of options. You're gonna fill in all those numbers there. And then if you have any additional notes, write them in there. This just alerts me like, yes, I should be looking for photos from you, or no, I didn't take any photos. And this alerts you, hey, send your photos to me. And then if you want a copy of your, data that you entered, you can turn this little toggle on down at the bottom, and that will email you a copy of your response. And when you're all done, you hit submit, and off it goes to my spreadsheet. And then I'm able to look at everybody's data and review photos and all that stuff. So that is the gist of surveys. That was a lot of information in a very short time. So hit me with questions or whatever you got. Let me know if there's anything I can clarify, or I should mention too that I will try to do like a in-person, on the road somewhere training whenever the next, potential event happens. So I'm not sure exactly where or when that will be yet, but I will send an email list out, a blast out to the email list, just letting folks know, hey, if you want to come see us in action, like come see some animals and identify stuff, we'll be meeting at this location on this date or whatever. And somebody typed a question in the chat. I should look at that. What's the ideal amount of time you'd like us to be out for each evening? Doesn't really matter, Jane. Whatever, as long as you do one pass through your survey section, it might be, if you have a real short survey section, it could be 15 minutes, 30 minutes. If you move animals off the road, it takes a little longer. Sometimes it's a couple hours. If you're really hardcore, you might be out there for 4 hours, but that is kind of up to you as to how, how much time you want to commit. Good question, Lauren. Yeah, if you do 2 passes of your road segment, you would just submit the Google form twice, once for each pass.
Are you making this video available someplace that we can rewatch all the ID?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so I will send out the video thing, and I will also send around some of the North Branch Nature Center's like info. They have a nice manual, and they have some like photos with some ID stuff that goes with them, that could be handy for like if you wanted to even print it off and bring it out in the field with you or something. If you have questions or want to review like actual field marks, I do recommend the Vermont Herp Atlas, vtherpatlas.org. We have detailed like species information on each species, and field marks and photos and all that stuff on there. Let's see. Kristen says, oh, should we be looking for animals only on the road surface or also on the shoulders or near the road surface too? I guess just include the animals on the road surface just to make it clear and easy. So just skip those ones nearby, although you probably will see them. You'll see them on your way back through. And I guess I should mention too, if you do count twice, like if you go out and then you also want to survey on your way back, you should probably move the dead animals off the road so you don't double count the dead guys, which can be a little yucky, but I guess that's what I've seen people use these spatulas. You could use a spatula, I suppose, to scrape the dead animals off the road. It's kind of sad. Or you can just, be gross like me and pick them up and wash your hands well afterwards. If you do handle a lot of dead animals, you should wash your hands before rubbing your eyes. I will mention that because like gray tree frogs in particular have a little toxin in their skins and won't bother you, but if you were to rub your eyes or like get it in your mucous membranes, it will make your eyes burn for a while. Oh, and let's see here. Another question in the chat. What if you see a frog or salamander crossing the road, but it's going the wrong way? Good question. Not towards where they are supposed to go. Do you move it the way it's going or the way it's supposed to go? You should move it the way it's going, even though it seems wrong. because who knows, maybe that salamander has already done its breeding at the pond and it's moving back uphill. So you should move it the way it's going. And it may just turn around and go back the other way, but not for us to decide. Okay, any other questions?
Kate, I moved up here from Montpelier recently, and I in Montpelier was trying to get involved in the North Branch amphibian surveys. And I know I looked at their map recently, and they have just like 1 or 2 red and yellow road segments in Hinesburg.
Yeah.
So is it safe to assume that those are different than the Hinesburg Conservation?
Not necessarily, no. I think we probably overlap on our road segments. But I know the one on Swamp Road we also have, and I'm trying to think where their other one is. But I presumably we have the same road segments, and we could probably, work it out to share data with them. I am in touch with their coordinator too. So seems like we ought to be able to share data that way.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Kate, it's Barbara 4-Hour calling.
Hey, Barbara.
My concern is I would need to be paired with someone who is much more computer savvy and telephone usage than I am. I do not have a cell phone that I use often, so it would be a huge learning curve. I do have spatulas and clear plastic things, so
Nice.
So just to warn you, I'm a dinosaur.
Yeah, that is fine. We can work that out. Or we can, either pair you with someone who has those things, or figure something else out. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, not seeing any more questions. I will drop my email in the chat, which probably you guys all have already, but in case you don't, you can send an email to either of those. I get them both. So, and I will look forward to hearing from any of you who want to volunteer who I haven't already communicated with. And like I said, I'll send out an email once this recording is available online, and I'll send out some additional materials to, like the data sheet and the map of, the areas, so you guys can look at those and see if there's something nearby you that you might want to volunteer for. Okay, thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was fun.
Good.